Hour. This is Jennifer Coffey here at OSEP, and I'm going to be turning it over to Lynn Hatfield in just a moment. And thank you for joining us for the Coaching Community of Practice. And today, Casey Olson from the Kansas Learning Network, which is part of their Technical Assistance System Network, also known as TASN, will be speaking to us about how she supports school district building leaders in using data for their improvement activities. So I will turn over to Len so he can walk you through some of the, just some reminders about your phone and the overall system. Thanks, Len.
Good morning, everyone, or as it is from the Pacific Coast. I've just got a couple of introductory slides here for you, just to remind you. The first is our title page, then a reminder to mute your mics unless you wish to speak. And then finally, we'd like to have you activate the chat window. And please put your name, role, organization, state, and email address in that space if you would. That lets us have a sense of who's participating, and that's really useful. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and then we'll have Casey begin her presentation.
As Casey's putting that up, I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about her. So how this came about, just a reminder that this group, we did a survey at one point, and you told us what you're most interested in learning about. And one of the areas you wanted to hear about, talk about, work together on, was about how to support the use of data as a coach. And so I asked Amy Gomber-Erickson and Patty Noonan, do you have anyone that you would recommend for this? And no one had come to my mind automatically that I hadn't already used quite a bit. And they recommended Casey right away. They were very excited about the work that she's doing and a presentation they'd seen her do. And so Casey agreed to do it. We really appreciate her. And I was just telling her that we are going to have this presentation up on our homepage at SIG Network because I think it is so foundational to all of our work in SIG Network is this use of data. We're asking for lots of great data to be collected. We've got fidelity data, we've got outcomes data, we've got data about how you're providing your professional development, what that looks like, progress monitoring. And so, but how do you make these data work for the districts that you're working with, the schools that you're working with? And so Casey, as I said, works for TASN, Kansas Learning Network. She supports district and building leaders statewide in developing and implementing school and district plans of improvement. So I will turn it over to you, Casey.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. I have to say I am extremely honored and humbled to be given this opportunity to be with you today in our learning. And yep, as Jennifer said, I am an implementation coach for the Kansas Learning Network. And I primarily support districts and schools across the state who are eligible for comprehensive or targeted supports and improvement. And I primarily support by coaching superintendents, principals, and then their leadership teams to build capacity around school improvement efforts centered on data-based decision-making. And just to kind of give you a brief background of how this all came about is that as an implementation coach, I have seen over the years a repeated need for all of the teams that I support, and they struggle with using data effectively or efficiently to make decisions. And when the leadership teams come together with the intention of looking at data, but they tend to get stuck quickly and give up. And so what I found were patterns beginning to emerge in the barriers that the teams were facing. And so what I'm going to share with you today is a resource that I have started to pull together as a framework for data analysis. And so it's a map that can be a helpful facilitation tool and a guide for any team, regardless of the decisions they are needing to make. And so one goal that I have for our time together is for us to spend time really harvesting the collective wisdom among us as coaches throughout the United States to enhance and add to this framework. So that way we all leave with our tool belts a little bit fuller and then better equipped as professionals to serve and coach teams who are feeling overwhelmed by that pressure to make database decisions. So I have planned this to be interactive. So I encourage you to participate in that and really push our own thinking as well.
And Casey, I just entered a message into the chat pod that please, we're a small but mighty group today, as happens sometimes in the summertime. And so we really need all of your thinking and all of your activity, because that's how we are going to learn best in a situation like this. So please be ready to engage with the great activities that Casey has planned for us.
Thank you. Yes, it's only helpful, only work if we all participate. So first, just to kind of activate and engage our thinking, our team has been trained in the Adaptive Schools Framework for Facilitation, which is Bruce Wellman and Bob Garmston's work. So you'll probably hear me reference them throughout our time together. But I want to start us with just a brief inclusion activity to activate and engage our thinking. So first, I want you to think about a team that you support with making database decisions. And if you don't support a team, think about a team that you are currently part of. Okay. Now, while you're holding that team in your mind, what I would like you to do is have a quick reflection. What are some of the common barriers this team faces when making a database decision? So just kind of silently reflect, think about 1 to 3 barriers. You can write them down. And once you have identified them, I'm going to have you type the barrier into the chat box. And it's okay if you type the same barrier that somebody else has already typed, because that just produces more data that it is a real barrier living out there, and we'll want to address it. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then you can read through the barriers in the chat. So when you've identified your barriers, just go ahead and just type in, just briefly, what's something that they run into that could be a barrier.
And do you want me to read them out to you, Casey, or do you want to read them?
Oh, maybe I didn't see them. Thank you. I see them now. Yes. So using consistent data. Yep. Different priorities, silos, admiring the problem. Absolutely. Spending a lot of time on contingencies. What if? Yes. So not all in the same understanding about why the data is collected. Absolutely. What is measured and what is it used for? Yes, so a lot of confusion. I'm seeing just consistencies between data selection and then how to make meaning of that data, as well as getting stuck and admiring the problem. And yes, I love this last one, not knowing how to use the data for practical purposes. I think when we say the word data, if we aren't familiar with an Excel spreadsheet, we kind of freak out and run away. And so as educators, it's important to know that data analysis doesn't have to be intimidating. And so hopefully today we can address all of these barriers through what I have posed, and what we don't address, let's harvest together some other ideas that could address them as well. So thank you for your participation. So as we go into the data analysis map, I'm going to begin with just a brief overview. So this is a visual that will represent the framework in a linear fashion. However, we all know that when we're in the work, it's messy. and complex, and it's not always this clean cut. Yet the purpose of this map is to allow teams to pause and take what we call a balcony view of their work and progress to help build awareness of where they are in the process, as well as to break it down into small and manageable chunks. So that way they can create clarity and actionable, focused, intentional tasks. So I'm going to first walk you through the map, and I'm going to intentionally be very vague because during this overview, I don't want to give too many specifics because we're going to spend the rest of our time diving into each phase shortly. So teams will begin with inquiry. Now, I'm going to say this multiple times, but just to make a note, teams do not always have to start at the very beginning, but I'm going to show you what it would look like if they did. So this is where they pose a question, something they're wondering about or noticing. Each phase has a question that will need to be answered that will then become the driver that will lead them to the next phase. So for example, the decision the team is trying to figure out in inquiry phase of the process is, what is the precise problem that needs to be attended to? That will lead them to a very specific problem. So once the team has narrowed down that decision and identified a specific problem, the team will then move into a data analysis focused on finding out why is the problem occurring and sustaining. So therefore, teams will be exploring root causes to discover foundational and high impact theories of causation. So here, I always like to use the saying, every system is perfectly designed to get the results we get. So what about that system needs to be changed in order to expect different results? So that leads to causation. And so once the team has come to a decision, the next phase that they'll be ready for is selecting an intervention. And oftentimes, I notice that teams don't see this phase as part of a data analysis. Often teams stop here with their data dialogues. However, during this phase, teams are leaning heavily on research as data to make informed decisions about evidence-based interventions. And so it is very much a data analysis, and the guiding question will be, what system or practice will impact the outcome? So that's what they're trying to decide. They're using data to inform that decision, and that will lead them to a clear intervention that aligns with the causation they've identified. And finally, the team will then consistently look for how to implement. So they're going to be moving towards implementation. Another common barrier that teams face is not having a framework for implementation, so they often aren't sure where to start. So as we move through the map, I'm going to show you a couple of implementation frameworks that I've used to help teams organize and prioritize their work. And to answer this driving question is, how will we educate, support, and monitor our efforts? Again, through a data analysis, they're looking for that answer. And then finally, that leads us to consistently progress monitoring their work by asking the following two questions. How is our intervention impacting our outcomes? And depending on that answer, possibly making a decision around how well are we implementing with fidelity. So the work will continue in a cyclical fashion here until they have reached sustainability, which is defined as becoming part of their system and will maintain regardless of who comes and goes. So that is just a brief overview, and I'm going to be referring back to this map throughout the presentation. But the big question is for teams and coaches is, how do you begin? So first, a team will need to locate their progress on the map. Remember, again, it's important that they don't always have to start at the very beginning every time they use the map. Teams need to think through the following questions. What has been attended to, what hasn't been attended to, and what is the appropriate next step? So where are we in this full process? And so I always put a coaching tip here, and I always ask myself before I walk into a situation, who do I need to be for this team? And so typically I find myself during this phase as a coach, it's important to push for evidence. So the purpose in doing so will be to both confirm and discern where they truly are compared to where they believe they are. And here's why this one's important is oftentimes teams believe they are in implementation phase when actually they haven't identified the correct problem or causation. And so they can often become stuck or frustrated if they haven't followed the process with integrity. And so you can be an impartial lens for them to possibly see what they might be missing. And typically this is done by asking questions and really by paraphrasing so they can hear back the evidence or lack thereof on where they believe they are. The second one is one that we talked about a lot in the barriers after they locate where they're at is selecting appropriate data. This becomes a huge block for teams. I've noticed that teams repeatedly run into this barrier of either not having enough data or having too much data, and it just takes too long to sift through it all, or we're sitting at the table without the right data to answer the questions. And so they can't make meaning of it, or even in other cases, they jump to conclusions that are not true because of where the data is leading them and not having enough. And so again, I consider them to become stuck. And so at this point, who I need to be as a coach is to pose questions that will allow the team to think flexibly. So what other influences or perspectives might we need to consider? And one tool I'd like to show you that I've used with teams before as well is this how might we look at our data graphic. And so this is adapted from Laura Lipton and Bruce Wellman's work, the book Got Data, Now What? And they call it the different dimensions of data. And so what we do is, depending on what phase the team is at on the map, I will refer them back to this document to help them select the appropriate data. And it really helps teams broaden their perspectives about the data selection, and then also helps inform them on how to use the data. And are they constantly just pulling from the same dimension or looking at it in that same way? And what is appropriate depending on where they're at in the data analysis map. And so even though I'm not going to show this graphic again, you'll notice as I go through each phase, it says data selection. And this is a tool you can use to pull back up to help teams kind of add to that. And this is not comprehensive. It's just a graphic that you can use. So I'm hoping if other people have tools out there too, you'd be willing to share those in a moment. So the third part of how we begin, after they have located their progress, selected the appropriate data, they're getting ready to create an agenda. And I call this a triple track agenda as a coach and helping them, coaching them through creating an agenda. And so it's triple track because there's three things teams need to consider when constructing their agenda and preparing for dialogue. And the first one is clarity of focus. So teams need to know where they are, where they're going, what decision needs to be made, and what is their specific action steps for that phase. Without focus, teams will be all over the place and the dialogue will move in too many different directions. And so this refers back to those first two items, locating where you're at, but does everyone know where you're at? And what is that phase going to be about? And the second one, the second track, is tools and techniques. So this refers to the processes and structures that are going to be used to guide teams through the analysis. As we know, data by themselves have no meaning. Collectively, we put them together to tell a story. And so there's hundreds of tools and techniques out there to assist teams in doing this, but a skilled facilitator will select the appropriate structures depending on where the team is at in the phase and what will help them move through dialogue and get to discussion. And so throughout our time, I'll show a few of those that I use, but I'm hoping also we can pull some more together during this time. And the third track that is very important as well is team development. So remember, sharp and efficient tools are extremely vital to build a house, but so is a skillful carpenter, because tools are useless without someone with the capacity to use them. Therefore, this third track is to focus on building the team's efficacy and craftsmanship. And we all know just because adults are sitting at the table doesn't guarantee that collaboration is actually occurring. So therefore, at each stage, there's a reminder for teams to think through those things that great teams do to ensure that they have high levels of collaboration. So I want you to pay attention throughout the time together of these three symbols here, because you're going to see them come up again throughout the presentation. And so a coaching tip for this one on getting teams started, where do they begin? Who do you need to be as a coach? Is to really raise group consciousness or awareness. So what are they not paying attention to that might become a stumbling block down the road? And so if they really have a clarity of focus and team development, but they're lacking in tools and techniques, that's what you want to raise their awareness to, or vice versa on any of those three areas on how they begin. So I've done a lot of talking right now, so it's time for me to check in with you briefly. So I want you to think from a big picture perspective. We haven't got into any of the details of what is included in each phase, but from a big picture perspective, what have you heard so far that might help any of these barriers that we originally identified? So what connections are you making? If you would take a moment and type those in, and we'll see where people are at and what connections they're making so far.
You see you have a couple of
Yes,
submissions.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So yes, being able to hone in on one problem and identify root causes allows teams to better understand what data to collect and why. Absolutely. And so we're going to go into talking about why that's important and what barriers it might prevent along the way. Yeah. Oh, graphics. Yeah, graphics are very helpful to kind of get that conversation to be on the same page. Yes, absolutely. Clarity of focus. Yes, so that's the same. I see these last two comments connect, being on the same page, clarity of focus, especially when doing a data dialogue, we can be all over the place. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. And keep, as those connections rise to the top, feel free. You don't have to wait for this time at any point. If you're making a connection that you want to share with everyone to make sure we're all making the same connections, please feel free to add to that as well. So thank you for your participation. Okay, so we're going to now zoom into the map and get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty details here. So where they're at on the map, if a team is starting right at the beginning, we're starting with inquiry and moving into problems. So we're gonna see what that looks like. So remember, you start with a question. It could be as broad as, how are our students doing in reading compared to their peers? Or how might we improve our overall attendance rate? Or possibly something a bit more specific as, what are our lowest performing indicators in math? So in this phase, teams are in that wondering phase. They're starting to make observations and posing questions. Possibly they've noticed a gap or a decline in student outcomes. And so they're simply wondering what's going on. And so during this phase, the team is focused on answering the following question: what is the precise problem that needs to be attended to? So again, you see that symbol of focusing direction, that's going to be the driving question. And during each phase, I will give teams some specific action steps to attend to, so you can see those on this side. Some of those action steps will need to take place during the data analysis dialogue, and some of them will take place afterwards as an extension to prepare them for the next phase. So it's typically a data collection action step. But for the sake of time, today I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail about those action steps, but I wanted to post everything so that way you could refer back to it, and then you can ask questions individually if you need to later. So question 2, looking at what data, part 2 over here, is what data are they going to be looking at for the data analysis? Since it's going to be focused on a comparison and problem identification, that's what we're focusing our attention on to for this phase, and that's all, is that I want to push teams to look at selecting data from those information altitudes. So thinking about where they are compared to what. So are they comparing it to zooming out, zooming in, a peer group? What are they comparing it to? Possibly even right now, a lot of my teams are working through their identifying gaps. So I'll push teams to look at triangulating their data. So quantitative, qualitative, what's that disaggregated data look like? What's going on with our subgroups? And really pulling in as many as we can, answering that question, compared to what, how are we doing, to make meaning of that data first. And so we'll refer back to that graphic to help them select data. And all of these pieces help them create a focus on the agenda that during this time, these are the only things that we're attending to. And so next, the team is going to think through specific tools to use for the analysis. There's so many options that this list could be endless, but I only have a few on here because they're the ones that I use the most. However, I will share them as examples, but I'm certain that there are much more that you could bring to the table with the experience of this group. So as we go through this, please make note of any great tools or tips that you have, and you can share them in the chat, or there'll be an opportunity to share them shortly as well. But before I do share all of the tools, I do want to draw your attention to this final box, which is the team development. So you'll see that third icon for the triple track agenda. And this box is actually going to be the same for every phase because, in my opinion, these are the 4 most foundational elements of a team's development. Again, it's not a comprehensive list, but only my beliefs based on my experience with teams. And so I'll go through them on this one, but I won't go through them on every one. So team roles, wondering who's going to be the facilitator, who's going to be your note takers, who's going to be a skilled participant, and what does that look like? What are those responsibilities? As well as who's our knowledge holder or role authority. And then norms for collaboration. This is how this conversation is going to take place. Again, this comes from adaptive schools, but in particular, leaning on 3 norms of pausing, paraphrasing, and posing questions. And here's why. Pausing, we want thoughtfulness, and we want to provide processing time. It's not about idea stacking or speed talking. We want to allow that time for people to actually think and digest. Paraphrasing, so it's our goal to first seek for understanding before placing your own ideas on the table. This is where posing questions come into play as well, so you can push for clarity, specificity, truly seeking to understand each other, and confirm that you understand by paraphrasing it back to them, not repeating it, but using different words or concepts to ensure that you're understanding on the same page. That addresses one of the barriers we listed earlier of not having a clear understanding around the problem. And so if we can use these norms of collaboration through paraphrasing, hopefully we can flush some of that out before it does become a barrier. Number 3 is balanced participation. So this doesn't mean that everyone has to speak for the exact amount of time. That's close to impossible and really not efficient, but rather everyone is given the same opportunity to speak. And then you're honoring both internal and external processors. And then number 4 is level of empowerment. And so being very clear ahead of time, what is the decision-making authority? Who holds that? So does this team hold full empowerment to make this decision? Or Are you just making a recommendation to another decision maker? Or possibly it's just to inform yourself around the decision. And so what is your level of empowerment, or the team's level of empowerment prior to going into this, will be helpful in how they think about it as well. And a coaching tip for this phase is that to be specific. So pose questions that push for specificity. As we go through one of the tools, I encourage teams to create a precision problem statement to get as specific as possible. And we're going to go through why that's important. I know you've already listed that as a barrier as well. And so hopefully these tools will be helpful for you. And as the coach, it's your role to stay neutral, but to push them on getting specific through that. And so let's go look at some of the tools for this phase. So again, in the adaptive schools, Wellman and Garmston recommend using the collaborative cycle of learning to help move a group from dialogue, which is all about placing ideas on the table, exploring and discovering, pushing thinking, seeking to understand, and then transitioning into a discussion where the goal is to begin sifting through and narrowing down ideas to come up with a sufficient consensus. And so this process allows teams to make decisions that stay made in the shortest amount of time, and people leave the meetings happy and can support the decisions. And so again, I'm not going to go through everything on this page, but knowing that the cycle, you'll see a cycle for every single phase, and it has 3 rounds. So activating and engaging, which is that hook, sparks thinking. Explore and discover, that's that dialogue, making meaning of the data. What story is it telling us or not telling us? And you'll notice on this one, there's several questions that I've posed that are specifically around inquiry moving into problem. And then organizing and integrating is always that decision-making phase. And also an action step is listed to help prepare for that next phase. So how do you organize and integrate and get prepared to keep moving through the map? And so another tool that can be useful again with Wellman and Lipton is in data-driven dialogue. They identify 6 causal categories that are the majority of school related issues fall underneath one or more of these 6 categories. So I'm going to show you a few different ways today on how you might use these categories when working with schools, depending on what phase they are in. And so for example, here's one way you might use them. To begin, comparing data, because in this phase we're doing a comparative analysis. We're going to start looking for strengths and weaknesses in each category and listing them visually to show the current state and to begin identifying problem areas. So for example, if you're looking at instructional data, and you can identify what is the data showing us that are strengths in our instruction, and what are some barriers within that instruction. And so it just creates that visual for you to start to see where you're at. During this phase, the team has had an opportunity now to work through the collaborative cycle. They're trying to identify these 5 essential questions. So what, how, where, who, and when. And so problem identification is so important, and I told you I would attend to this one, and so here's why. Oftentimes teams will skip this stage and move right to causation. So let's say we have a team of 10 people and you just give them a problem without giving them time to make meaning of it or to dialogue about it and to actually see the data to identify this problem on their own. So therefore, you might have one problem, but 10 slightly different interpretations of that same problem. And so the barrier will come when you are trying to solve the problem. So I see the problem one way and I start sharing my thinking, but you may not be able to make the same connections because my solution and the way I perceive the problem doesn't align with your perception. So they will, I often see, become stuck in that dialogue, unwilling to budge and not understanding each other. And so a second reason is sometimes teams don't go deep enough in this phase to narrow down the problem. This was already also a barrier that I know someone had posed as well. And so when the concern is too broad, we kept it too broad, we didn't get specific enough, which is why I use the word precision for that problem, is that it causes issues during the root cause analysis. Problems are already complex, but the more broad it is, the more spread out the root cause analysis will be, and it will be close to impossible to find specific patterns and trends, and then it just becomes a guessing game to identify root causes, or we're not actually identifying root causes at all, but more effects of the same hidden causes. And so to be as specific as possible and support teams in identifying as many of these questions as you can is going to be a great asset in coaching. Okay, so that was phase one. Now I can move a little quicker through, but you'll notice that each phase is a full collaborative cycle in itself. So that's the power in the map. And a reminder that teams, again, don't need to start at the beginning. They need to start at any point that they're ready for, but then they will move through the map in a linear fashion. So possibly teams already had a clear problem. They all have the same understanding, so they could jump right into this next phase, which is problem to causation. And again, the driving question and point of the discussion for this phase will be, why is the problem occurring and sustaining? So what data are they going to need? And so I would refer back to that other graphic and say the focus will be centered around, again, a root cause analysis. So we're searching for dependence. And so they're going to, of course, bring that precision problem back from phase one. But then we're going to start looking at our aggregated and disaggregated data that maybe informs the problem, but we're really going to be focusing on lead and lag data and looking for what are those connections between what is leading to this problem. So again, that question of what about our system is causing these results? And so you want to look for those leading indicators that are causing this lagging data. So there's a list of a couple of tools that I'm going to show you as well. But you'll notice, again, the team development concepts are the same. So I'm not going to go over those again. And so during this phase, if they're going into this root cause analysis, who do you need to be as a coach? And someone mentioned this as well, is that solution centered. And so what is within their locus of control? So keep bringing teams back to that control. What can you control? What's part of your system? What can be changed? What do you have control over is going to be, I find myself being that person a lot as a coach for these teams. And so again, let's dive into a couple of tools. So in the problem, moving to causation stage, here is an example of what the collaborative cycle of learning might look like. So this could help a facilitator take a team through this process with some questions that I've posed, but there's several others out there that you could use. And so this is an example that was intentionally planned to allow the team to collaboratively discuss the data and make meaning of it prior to making those decisions. And here's a couple of tools. One tool that I've used is created those, so these are the 6 same causal categories from Wellman and Lipton, but place them into similar to a fishbone structure, but you place your problem in the middle, and then you can look through each category as a lens for possible causation, placing as many ideas on the table and then start to look for patterns and trends. Because again, problems are often they are complex, so they will probably fall into multiple categories, and you'll begin to see what's rising to the top, and then also, again, what is within our control. You'll notice one barrier that I face a lot with my teams, especially at the school level, is it's a lot of student blaming. Just the students bring a lot of stuff with them, and teams often get stuck there. So this protocol allows teams to name those and identify those, but move past them too and look for other options to see what else might be within their control. So it really is a nice tool that shifts them out of problem-centered to more of a solution-focused through the process. Another example is very similar. This is a more traditional fishbone. So again, first a team would place their identified problem on the right-hand side this time. So again, reminding them this is their lagging data or their outcome data. And then they would begin to think backwards and identifying leading indicators. So what might be causing us to get the results we're getting, coming up with their own categories, and then digging deep into that typically I tend to pair this model with the 5 whys structure to really help teams think deep and again, uncover those patterns and making sure we are going to the root. And so that's been helpful for teams as well. And remember, always highlighting, focusing on what's in their control, which leading indicators are foundational and have the biggest impact. They don't need to work on all of them. What are those true root causes that are within their control? Okay, I've done, again, a lot of talking now. And so it's time for me to pause and give us an opportunity to harvest some of our collective wisdom in this group. So I asked you to think through any additional tools or techniques that you've used during these first 2 phases. And I want you to tell me what's coming up for you. So please post any tools or techniques, or you could coaching tips or any connections, even if you liked something, you can post it here of these first 2 phases. So all the way from inquiry to deciding on the problem to looking for causation through that root cause analysis. What else have you used with teams that you have found successful? Or what's a coaching tip that you've had? So please go ahead and post those in the chat, and we'll take about 2 minutes to do so. All right. So using, yes, NERN tools like the DCA to help teams identify. Absolutely. Use the fishbone for determining the causes. Coach's role. Yeah, thank you. It is helpful to know who we need to be in each one. And Jennifer, with the NERN tools, I'm going to refer to a couple of those later when we get into the implementation stage. So I'm so happy that you brought that up. Thank you for reminding us that we could use some of those tools during this phase as well, and the strengths that they have to draw upon. Absolutely. Oh, yes. Thank you, Casey. Engaging in a structured ORID conversation, focused conversations, which can help people think more objectively about the data. Absolutely. The ORID structure is an excellent tool that we could add to this list for sure. And it's applicable for any of these conversations on just how to have a conversation. And so you could actually place that right there in the explore and discover phase of the cycle and have teams think about it in each 4 of those different ways, focus conversations as well. Thank you, everyone. And again, feel free at any point to continue adding ideas or connections, or if there's something that you like, you can add that as well so we can all see those. So we'll continue on here. Okay, so jumping back in, phase 3. So once your team has come to an agreement about root causes, You are now ready to transition from problem-centered to solution-centered by selecting an intervention. And so you're really looking at that question, what change to your system can you make, or practices, or both, might make the greatest impact based on your root cause analysis. So really thinking about that connection and being purposeful in selecting an intervention. So here you'll notice the data being used is evidence-based research. So as I stated before, teams don't always believe that this phase is a data dialogue. Some hold the belief that data-based decision-making is over and now they're moving to something different. But I often remind teams that this is still data. It is research's data because they're using it to inform their decisions, and therefore they need to go about it in the very same way. And so tools that they can lean on here for this phase. I'm not going to show most of them, but I rely heavily on, we use Kansas Star, which is Kansas's version of Industar, and there are wise ways there. Basically, they're evidence-based practices, and they provide the research briefs with those. So I lean heavily on that for teams, as well as John Hattie's work around effect size is another very important piece to pull in for data here. And then another resource that we lean on is What Works Clearinghouse to help inform decisions about interventions, especially if they're choosing a curriculum or a program. And so I want you to be thinking as well, what are some other tools to help teams select evidence-based practices? And you can put those into the chat at any time so we can learn from each other there too. And so something to pay attention to at this phase, who do I need to be as a coach? I always have to help teams be in systems thinking. And so I really am intentional to pose questions that encourage the team to think from a systems perspective and really think about how might we change our system, or what do we need to do differently in our practices. But this isn't always natural to educators to think from that perspective. And so to pull them out and help with that is a strong role that I play in this phase. And so here's an example, again, of a data dialogue. And so we're using that collaborative cycle of inquiry, just like we would for any other analysis. And again, you could put in those different pieces throughout this time. And like was mentioned, the ORID model could definitely go in here as well into this explore and discover phase. And so this could be customized however you want to use it. But again, it leads them to a very clear decision. And then also what data they'll need to collect next, which will lead them into the fourth phase, which is intervention into implementation. And so this is all about implementation science. And so this is where we're going to see, as someone mentioned before too, those NERN models and coming into that implementation research network resources. And so this phase is so important, and let me tell you why. Because changing behavior is hard. And changing adult behavior is probably the most difficult. And so oftentimes teams create these beautiful, amazing, thoughtful plans, but then they fizzle out because we're not intentional about implementation and looking at it in a scientific way. And so as we look through this phase, what I have noticed throughout my times is that teams need a framework. So the framework for implementation allows them to once again take a step back, see what their current state data is telling them, and then allows them to focus and align resources on drivers that matter and can actually make an impact. So here as a coach, you're going to want to focus on Diltz's logical levels of learning. And if you haven't heard about this before, I encourage you to research Robert Diltz's work. Basically, in a nutshell, he believes that our behaviors are directly aligned and congruent with our values, beliefs, and assumptions. So oftentimes we try to change behavior by changing the environment, right? We change the environment to try to impact behavior, which might work, but it typically has small, limited, or short-term effects. So what his research suggests is focusing on the internal beliefs, values, and assumptions of people and influencing those over time. And when those beliefs change, their behaviors will follow suit. So therefore, having a team think flexibly about the various beliefs and values and assumptions of all stakeholders, or actually bringing in survey data, that qualitative data that can help inform about those beliefs, will be extremely beneficial when making decisions. And so as we go on here, I'm going to show you a couple of implementation framework tools that I've used with teams that can be helpful in thinking about this from a data lens. So here's a few examples of some of the implementation frameworks that I've used with teams. This one's a very basic one. It's just the 3 lenses: educate, support, and model. And really this comes from the science, behavior science, on teaching a new skill to someone, that they move from acquisition to fluency to generalization. And so this framework takes into consideration all 3 of those lenses. Oftentimes we pour a lot of our resources into PD, but then we forget to support and monitor those efforts. Or we just set the expectation and monitor it without building the skills or providing the support along the way. And so this has helped teams really think about all 3 pieces in a very simple way. And then this graphic just gives you some guiding questions to go along with each phase as they're coming up with some action steps. Another example on how to utilize that previous framework through the lenses of the 6 causal categories. So this is just taking it a little step further, and it allows teams to be even more specific. And so, for example, again, if we're wanting to improve instruction with our new intervention, so we're saying, what do we need to educate them? What skills are necessary? How will we support those new skills? And how are we going to monitor internally and externally? What will those accountability pieces look like? And so that's just an ability for the facilitator to walk through. And then here is a blank one that I've provided. That's just a blank template for the team to use as they're thinking through their action steps. Another one is an implementation framework. This is adapted from NERN. So someone had mentioned that National Implementation Research Network that they use as a resource. So fantastic. And this focuses on the implementation drivers. So this one is much more comprehensive, but it's also a bit overwhelming. So sometimes I use this one internally just as a coach to help me assess where a team is at, or possibly just with a principal to help give them a perspective and to know really, again, how to utilize and focus resources. And so this one just all depends on their readiness, but it takes each one of the 9 drivers, and if you're not familiar with it, you can research those a little bit more, but ask some driving questions to help think what has been attended to, but what hasn't been attended to, where do we need to focus our efforts. And again, here is a blank copy for teams to use as they think through some of those drivers along the way as they're building their plans and implementing their practices. And finally, this leads us to the last phase, which is implementation to sustainability. And I would say this is where teams are at the most often. So they get linear through this process, and then they're here. And this is where it becomes very cyclical in nature on this phase. And so for here, there's actually 2 driving questions. And the answer to the first one determines how you'll proceed on the second one. And so I'm going to show you a brief flowchart in just a moment that will explain this further. But as you move through this phase, the focus again is on progress monitoring, being very intentional with that. And oftentimes teams select an intervention, but they never properly assess its effectiveness. And so when there's a lack of progress, teams often blame it on the intervention and never fully assess the fidelity of implementation. And so there's so many variables in this phase, and it's important to explore each one to know how to focus efforts and next steps. So as a coach for this phase, who do you need to be? Think back to those implementation drivers. So start to know them well so you can begin to raise consciousness about, again, what's been attended to and what hasn't been attended to. And that'll really help you form questions to prevent teams from being stuck, because usually they think through 1 or 2, but you can have a more comprehensive lens for them and add to their thinking. So this is the main tool that I use for this phase. Again, it's cyclical, so they're constantly coming back to this as their progress monitoring, but it's a very simple flowchart. So starting at the top, again, ensuring that the appropriate amount of time has passed, but they would look at their lagging indicators, so their outcome data, and ask, do they show evidence of significant growth? If the answer is yes, fantastic. Now we're moving to think about sustaining. How do we need to sustain those efforts so it doesn't go away when we stop focusing on it? And then the next one, if it's a no, we're going to now ask about fidelity. So does the data show that you're implementing with at least 80% fidelity, right? Are we taking their medicine exactly as the doctor prescribed it? So we want to make sure we answer that before we know if it's working or not. If we say yes, yeah, our data shows that we have implemented with fidelity. And so possibly here, now they need to go back to the map. Maybe they didn't identify the correct root cause. Possibly even further than that, maybe they haven't identified the correct problem. Maybe it's something deeper or more specific than what they originally identified. So they're going to have to work their way back on the map a little bit there. If it's a no, if their fidelity data says, no, we are not implementing with fidelity, so we can't honestly say if our intervention is going to have an impact on the outcome or not, then they're going to be focusing on improving that fidelity, which again goes back to that behavior science of educating, supporting, and monitoring that adult behavior and looking for those, maybe those social barriers of why are people not adding these new practices or what's becoming a barrier to the stakeholders within the system. And that's where they're going to spend their time there. One last quick tool is adapted from NERN as well. And so this is a template that we just adapted, and it takes the implementation drivers on the left and the stages of implementation across the top and kind of gives them a visual of assessing where they're at, again, from that balcony lens, pulling back a little bit. And so I found this helpful, again, for me as a coach. Maybe I wouldn't do this with a team, but I would do this about one of the teams that I support to help me know, okay, where are they focusing their energy and resources, and what are they not attending to that I might help bring up or ask questions around, or you could provide it to the team and have them discover those areas for themselves as well. So I included that here for you to use. But as our time is now coming to a close, and before I open it up freely for questions, I would like everyone to kind of summarize your learning from our time together today. So please take a minute and identify your most important point. So think back to that original team that I had you identify, either again, one you supported or one you're a part of. And what is one takeaway from this learning that you want to be sure to remember and possibly even apply with this team? And just go ahead and post your most important point in the chat box for us all to read. Okay, so thank you, Jennifer. She said she liked the concept of who do I need to be as a coach could be used as a frame for the entire coaching session. Yeah, that's such an important question for us to be adaptive and moving, is thinking about who we need to be and why. It might be fluid based on the team or the situation. So thank you. Fantastic. Yes, please share any of them. And I would even offer to please help me out and add what might you add to these tools to load my tool belt as well. I'm constantly learning and refining. So please make it your own. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I'm glad you found it helpful. So as you continue to add your most important points, please continue to do so. And then I just want to open it up as well. If anyone had any other questions, I know we're running almost out of time here, but if you have any questions that you'd like to pose to the group here, and then pretty soon I'll pose my information too. And so we can add to the thoughts of others. I'm seeing.
We have one question. Do you use the same process for all districts? Do you adapt it based on CSI/TSI?
Yeah, thank you. And so, yes, so this main process I use for all of our districts, again, depending where they're at. And the beauty of it is that it can be as deep and complex as you want it to be, but it can also be adapted to a real short time. One of the barriers that I noted is that time for each phase is a huge barrier for schools. And so it can be adapted, and that collaborative cycle of learning can be shortened. So even if you only have a 45-minute block to do one of the phases, you can have a very focused conversation, choosing techniques and tools that will focus the group and make a decision in a short amount of time. Sometimes, a phase will have to last a couple of meetings depending on how complex it is, but it can be adaptive. And so I wouldn't say it's a cookie cutter process by any means, but we do adapt it to all ones. Mm-hmm. And
I just want to add one thing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the great thing is too, it's relevant to all schools, not just schools that are identified for needing comprehensive or targeted supports. So if you do know other schools that can use it as well, or teams, that's fantastic too. So Jennifer, what was going to add?
So Jennifer from Oregon had added that the hexagon tool from CSTEP is important for selecting an evidence-based practice. And they just redid the lesson around that on the Active Implementation Hub. So it might be new even for you, and it might be easier to share now too, since you can point people to the Active Implementation Hub and they can learn a bit more about it.
That's fantastic. Absolutely. I was just going to put on here at the very end, I just have my contact information, but I also included my director, Michelle Hayes of the Kansas Learning Network. So if you had any questions specifically about our network or support that we provide, or TASN, she'd be able to answer those, as well as Dr. Amy Gomer Erickson from our TASN evaluation team. And so any questions for evaluation, please contact her. And then I also put in our network's website and the TASN website as well. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I just thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Casey. This was extremely comprehensive, and you got through it all. I'm very impressed. I thank you, everyone, for being actively engaged today. I could tell how much learning was going on, and oftentimes it's just connecting a lot of different dots, and you did that for us. So we appreciate your time, Casey, and how much of yourself you put into this presentation. It was great visually as well as conceptually. And we will definitely contact you if we have questions. Otherwise, I'm going to be posting this up on SIG Network. If anyone has a team member who wasn't able to join us today and you think this would be helpful, they can just go to signetworks.org and it'll be up and ready for them, I would say, in the next day. Lynn, is that appropriate?
Yep, that's about right.
Okay, thanks, Lynn, and thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.